Welcome to Training Student Workers on FERPA. This is a guide on how to approach training your student workers on FERPA regulations. This training can be used in any office on any set of student workers. To begin the training, you should start by explaining why your student workers need to understand FERPA policies and regulations. Studies show that explanation-based learning helps students gain a greater understanding of information and promotes transfer of knowledge to new situations. Explanation-based training provides clarity for students as well as promotes unity. If your students unite with you, they will more likely pay attention and join your goal of ensuring everyone in the office is knowledgeable enough to handle student records. This will turn the training from a lecture to a collaborative learning environment. EBL also encourages connection and ownership. If your students make connections between FERPA regulations and their own personal job responsibilities, they will be more likely to pay attention, apply the regulations, and remember the information. For example, you could use a slide like this one, titled Why Learn About FERPA. It talks about colleges and universities having an ethical and legal obligation to protect the privacy of students. It talks about how these policies are just ethical minimums and they are not the maximum, and students are able to go above and beyond these regulations to ensure the privacy of students. And it also states that ensuring you are following FERPA regulations is essential to being an ethical employee and following the law. Another thing that you may want to start with is making sure that you point out the difference between FERPA regulations and HIPAA regulations. To do this, you should begin by defining both and explaining that students will be dealing primarily with FERPA regulations. FERPA stands for the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. HIPAA, on the other hand, is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And according to the Department of Education and their January 2013 revisions to the HIPAA regulations, HIPAA doesn't apply to college education or treatment records. Typically, student workers handle the education records of students, but they may also occasionally come across treatment records. Understanding the difference is essential in identifying each, which is important as each has specific ways that they can be used. Treatment records are usually created by a physician or a medical professional and can only be used in connection with treatment and shared with treatment providers. This includes the health center and counseling records. These records can be turned into educational records if they're used for any other reason besides treatment. These cannot be shared without written consent from the student they belong to. These are handled very similarly to personally identifiable information. They are not available to anyone other than professionals providing treatment or professionals of the student's choice. Students do not have a FERPA right to inspect and review that they have been shared outside of the healthcare field. On the other hand, there are education records. These are directly related to a student and kept by an educational agency or institution, such as the school that you and your student workers are working at. These records provide ways for parents of eligible students to gain access to records without consent. For example, if the student is a dependent on the parents' taxes, the parents have a right to see those records. Students also have a right to review these records before they are shared with anyone. This limits on how records can be used without written consent from the student unless they are subpoenaed. They can be disclosed without written consent in connection with court proceedings or subpoenas and in connection with a health and safety emergency. They can also be disclosed without student consent to parents who claim them as a dependent on their taxes. Both types of student records involve either PII, which is personally identifiable information, or PHI, which is protected health information. It is important to understand the types of PII because students will need to know what information they can and cannot give out. Students will not be able to disclose any personally identifiable information such as their name, address, zip code, names of relatives, date of birth, name of an employer, telephone number, email address, fingerprints, social security number, etc. to anyone. Once students understand what FERPA is and the different types of records and personally identifiable information, you can then get into what FERPA is meant to do. FERPA is meant to protect the privacy of students' education records, including their treatment records, but treats them differently. It requires written consent from parents or students 18 or older to release personally identifiable information from educational records. Students who are 18 or older are referred to as eligible students. It also provides ways to share information about an eligible student to parents without consent of a student, only if the student is filed as a dependent on tax forms. For the last few slides, I recommend going through the daily tasks in the office and practicing with students situations that may occur where they will need to use this information. This could be going through each student's job responsibilities and pointing out the areas in which they are dealing with education records, treatment records, or personally identifiable information. They could also practice in a simulation or role play where a parent or former teacher or employer calls them and asks for personally identifiable information. Have the student be able to determine if they are or are not allowed to share the information being asked. You can also have students analyze their own job responsibilities and point out ways that they can use FERPA. Review with students how you want them to handle a situation where they accidentally don't follow the FERPA regulations. Whether you are just beginning to work with your student workers or you have been working with them for a few years and are just now interested in FERPA training, I highly recommend facilitating a training yearly and using it in the future with any new hires. I recommend using this training as part of a new hire orientation packet or trainings that you do with any new professional or student worker in the office. It can serve as a good guideline or refresher for former employees, and a hard copy is beneficial for any last-minute questions a student or staff member might encounter while they are working with someone.